Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about John.
If we want to make sense of the book of John, I think we have to look back at the last 3 days of conversations we've had about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three accounts of the life of Jesus, the first three Gospels. And then I think John's book, the fourth Gospel, is going to make more sense because I think John wrote his book fully aware that these other three were already done and floating around out there because he's doing a very different thing. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are sometimes called the synoptic Gospels is a fancy term, but it's pretty easy if you break it down. Syn, like synonym, meaning same, and optic, like optic, meaning eyes. The idea being that they're coming from the same perspective. They're drawing on the same material. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all hyper rightly excited about Jesus. They view him as the completion of everything, and all four of them are trying to get the reader not just to read an interesting story about an interesting character. They want you to read it and be like, dang, that makes sense to me, and I got to wrestle with what I am going to do in response to the claims about Jesus. But these are also smart, empathetic people, and they understand that the world is big and diverse, and people are diverse, and you got to say it in a way that's going to make sense to different groups of people. So as a result, Matthew writes to Jewish people, and he's trying to convince them that Jesus is the long-promised king, the descendant of David, who is to reign forever. To do that, he speaks their language by drawing on a ton of stuff from the Old Testament and by leaning into the words of Jesus. Well, that's awesome and wildly successful, but it's not going to make sense to Roman people, and Mark has a soft spot in his heart for Roman people. So he writes to them. They're not going to know or care about or have as much patience for all the lore and background stuff. So he leans into the actions of Jesus to demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah, the servant, the one who delivers not just the Jewish people, but the whole world. Luke comes along as a Gentile outsider, and he's got a Greek brain, very philosophical, thinking about the unseen world and its relationship with the physical world. And so even though Luke very much acknowledges the deity of Jesus throughout his gospel, his emphasis is on the humanity of Jesus, the incarnation. That's why we get that big birth story in Luke. It makes sense that he would hit that physical birth, human part of Jesus harder than any of the other gospel writers. And to accomplish that with his audience in mind, he leans into the ordered details of the story of Jesus. Well, then sometime later after Matthew, Mark, and Luke, along comes this fourth gospel of John. It was almost surely written after 70 AD. That's a very important date that you and I haven't talked about yet, but it's the date that represents the destruction of the Second Temple, the one that Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah were around for, that was built back during the time of the Persians and expanded before the life of Christ under the direction of Herod the Great. That grand, glorious temple gets wrecked in 70 AD, about 40 years after the execution and resurrection of Jesus. This is a landmark, watershed moment in the history of everything. Almost certainly, John was written comfortably after that calamitous incident. And that fits with what we know about the lifespan of John the Apostle, who was in the inner circle of followers of Jesus, who we think is referred to in the Bible as the disciple who Jesus loved. That kid, John, would have just been a teenager when all of the Jesus stuff was happening, and he lived probably to around 100 AD, then wrote a whole bunch of stuff, including the historical church believes this Gospel of John. Now, John was definitely super aware that there were ordered quality accounts of the life of Jesus already floating around, and both because that ground had already been well covered and because times had changed, John sets out to do something different. He's not writing to Jews or Romans or Greeks. He's writing to the church, and he's writing to convince them or remind them that explicitly Jesus is God in the flesh. He leans in specifically to certain signs that Jesus does, 7 of them, that are meant to say Jesus is God in the flesh. And he leans into 7 statements where Jesus says, I am the this, I am the this. And those I am statements are a reference back to how God introduced himself by name in the burning bush to Moses, when Moses is like, all right, I'll go back and talk to him, but who should I say sent me? And God says, tell them I am sent you. In other words, I'm not just some cheap regional deity or an idol. I am essence. I am being. I am the God. Nothing short of pure and complete existence could even begin as a name to properly summarize the scope and expanse of the infinitude of this God. And John is making the case that that God took on flesh in Jesus, and Jesus is indeed God. It's a big, bold statement, and it's a clarifying statement for the early church who were just starting to get their mitts on all of these accounts of Jesus, and as we're starting to get into generation 2 and generation 3 and generation 4 of Christianity. And John, who's one of the last living witnesses, all the other disciples got killed in grisly ways by this point. He wants to spell out crystal clearly, hey, let there be no ambiguity. He claimed to be God. And just like Matthew, Mark, and Luke before him, John also has a thesis statement. At the end of the book, he spells out, hey, Jesus did a ton of other stuff, kind of acknowledging, you've read the other books, you're familiar with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Implicitly, that seems to be what he's saying. He did a ton of other stuff. We could fill infinite number of books with the things Jesus said and did, but what I have gathered here, I have gathered so that you would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's what John is going for. That's the gauntlet he's throwing down. That's what he wants to reassure the early church in, and that's what he wants to compel those who are not yet Christians toward, who would come upon this book. Now, John's gospel has material that's over 90% exclusive to John. So he's clearly picking up recollections and details that he thinks need to be preserved that didn't necessarily factor super heavily into the thesis or goals of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a very unique section in chapter 1 that talks about the Word of God taking on flesh, and that looks all the way back through the whole scope of history, indicating that this isn't some new idea, but that this was God's plan to deliver through Jesus, to reveal himself through Jesus, to take on flesh all along. Then after that, for the most part, things start up north in Galilee, and Jesus has these disputations, these back and forths with religious leaders and other people who don't know what to make of them. And over the course of that, many respond enthusiastically, many hang around and are curious but don't know what to make of him, and many others become very angry. Then, just like what we talked about in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, heads in that direction. John holds out the death of his buddy Lazarus as being the initiating event that moves him southward from the relatively safe confines of the north to the very unsafe big city and headquarters of all of his enemies down in Jerusalem. And in the pivot passage of the book, Jesus answers the last big remaining question about what kind of authority he actually wields. Can he back all of this up when he raises Lazarus from the dead, anticipating his own resurrection from the dead? After that, Jesus is received in Jerusalem with enthusiasm. He teaches his disciples a whole bunch more. He runs into all kinds of pushback. We get one big extended chunk of thought from him, including this beautiful, intimate prayer for the unity of future believers, that as future believers are one, that everybody would know that he and the Father are one. And then he goes to trial. He goes to execution. He's raised from the dead. And then we even get this little epilogue in chapter 21, where it looks like John was trying to provide some grandfatherly senior guidance through the words of Christ to a church that was just starting to find its footing and maybe wasn't totally sure coming out of Matthew, Mark, and Luke what to do with the legacy of Peter and some of the other disciples who wavered and fell apart under pressure during the events of Jesus' crucifixion and whatnot. And so we get Jesus' restoration of Peter, and the whole thrust of chapter 21 almost feels like a benediction, a blessing, an exhortation on John's way out the door to say that Jesus was teaching that his church will thrive when they depend on and focus on and listen to the Son of God, God in the flesh, the Christ, the Messiah, the King, the centerpiece of the church and God's redemptive plan, Jesus Christ himself. Now, when we look back on this with the 10,000-foot view, we see that the whole book is punctuated by these 7 I am statements that I was referencing earlier. Each of those accentuates a unique element or implication of his deity. They all accentuate his connection with his Father. And the summary version goes like this. He says, "I'm the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine." And ultimately, the whole I aming gets one extra spike of the football when the enemies of Jesus come to have him arrested. And they're like, "Hey, are you Jesus?" And he's like, "I am." And they all fall down physically because of the force of this declaration of Jesus' deity. Every now and then I'll hear people on the internet say, "Well, Jesus never claimed to be God." And to that I would say, I suspect that person has not read the book of John, or if they did read the book of John, they skimmed it and they haven't read the rest of the Bible. It really is, in the context of the larger Bible, absolutely explicit, pounded again and again that Jesus is claiming to be God in the Gospel of John. And if understandably that's kind of a lot to take in and think through, it just takes us right back to John's thesis statement in chapter 20 and verse 30. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. I say again, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. When you visualize the Gospel of John, picture 3 letters, I and then A-M, I am. There's no image that can better summarize what this gospel is about than those 2 simple words. When you think about the theme, reflect on Jesus is God. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, make sure to read enough of the context of the following passages to understand the I am statements that Jesus is making. Read the material around 6:35, 8:12, 10, 7 through 14, there are 2 I am statements in there, 11:25, 14:6, and the first part of chapter 15. We'll put all of that down in the show notes as well if you didn't have a chance to write it down. The Gospels, what an amazing payoff on all the setup from the Old Testament. What an amazing moment in and of themselves. What an amazing character to have God take on flesh. And now with the rest of the New Testament, we get to consider what the amazing implications of this will be moving forward. We got the book of Acts next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.